A pilot and his wife were conducting a routine flight to visit family for the Thanksgiving holiday. Unfortunately, he made a tragic mistake when they were moments away from landing and they crashed about a half mile from the runway. This was a heartbreaking tragedy, especially when you find out the real reason why they crashed. That's why we're going to talk about what happened during the flight and the mistakes that were made. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your Pilot Debrief. Our story begins on Saturday, November 19th, 2022, when two people got in their airplane and took off from the St. Louis downtown airport in Illinois to go visit family near Winston-Salem, North Carolina to spend the Thanksgiving holiday together. Joe was 64 years old and he was the pilot flying the plane. Although the NTSB didn't provide a copy of Joe's logbook with the investigation, they reported that he had over 1,400 hours of total flight time, including 155 hours in the make and model of aircraft he was flying when they crashed. Joe had a commercial certificate and was also a single and multi-engine flight instructor listed with the National Association of Flight Instructors. Sitting next to Joe on the flight was his wife Patty, who was 66 years old. They had been married for 43 years and were owners of a metal fabricating business and loved flying together, and this was supposed to be a routine flight to go visit their children and grandchildren. Before we talk about what happened during the flight, let me just say that my heart goes out to Joe and Patty's friends and family that they left behind. They were both well loved and respected, and to be honest, I was initially reluctant to tell this story because I think a lot of people can relate to family members traveling for the holidays, and the last thing that anyone expects to happen is the death of a loved one during the holiday season. However, I think there are still some very important lessons that we can learn from this despite how tragic it was. That being said, the aircraft Joe was flying was a 1964 Piper PA-30 Twin Comanche. If you're not familiar with this aircraft, it is a complex, light, twin-engine airplane with retractable landing gear that can seat between 4 to 6 people. The aircraft was registered in June of 2016 to an LLC in the town that Joe was from, and he posted this photo to Facebook in December of that year, showing the inside of the aircraft, reflecting that it's possible he owned and had been flying the aircraft for almost 6 years at the time of the tragedy. According to the NTSB, the weight and balance of the aircraft was not a factor in the crash. Additionally, the aircraft was equipped with 2 Garmin G5 electronic flight instruments, but unfortunately, because they didn't have memory cards installed, there wasn't any data available for the flight. That meant the NTSB had to rely on the ADS-B data transmitted by the aircraft, along with the radio calls that Joe made and what they found in the wreckage. Joe and Patty took off from the St. Louis downtown airport in Illinois, and on the first leg of their trip, they flew to the airport in London, Kentucky. However, when they were about to land, something went wrong, and Joe made a call on the radio saying that he was going around. He never declared it an emergency, and he didn't report any problems on the radio as he circled back around, and he was able to land on the next try without further incident. Now, when Joe walked into the FBO, someone asked him why he had to go around, and he said it was because he had an electrical failure on final, and he couldn't tell if his landing gear was fully down or not. Joe also said that the electrical system had been giving him some trouble on the aircraft, and he was offered help to fix the problem, but Joe said that he had other options available to get the gear down if necessary, including manually pumping the gear down. Either way, according to one witness, Joe appeared to be a little distracted, but he didn't seem to be too worried about the issue, and he never asked for anyone to take a look at the aircraft. In fact, he said the only reason they landed was so that his wife could use the restroom. Now, to be honest with you, at first, I didn't think it was important to share that part of the story, because the truth is that the landing gear was fully extended on the second flight when Joe crashed, and the NTSB didn't mention anything wrong with the landing gear or the electrical system in their final report. However, in my opinion, I think it's possible that this was a minor distraction that could have been on Joe's mind later in the flight as he was about to land. Either way, they didn't stay on the ground for very long in Kentucky, and after taking on some additional fuel, they departed around 10 o'clock local time to begin the last leg of their journey to Winston-Salem, North Carolina. It's worth pointing out that the weather was not a factor in this crash because they had clear skies and at least 10 miles of visibility throughout the flight. In fact, everything seemed to be going fine for most of the flight until Joe was about 10 minutes from landing. At that point, they were 8 nautical miles from the airport and descending through 3,500 feet. Joe was told to contact the Winston Tower, and he was advised that traffic had just departed from runway 33 and was turning southwest with an altitude indicating 3,000 feet. A few seconds later, when Joe called the tower, he told them he would be landing on runway 33. However, the tower controller told him to enter a left base for runway 4. Joe initially didn't respond, and so the controller told him again to enter the left base for runway 4. This time Joe acknowledged the controller, but he got the two runways confused, and he said he would enter a left base for runway 34. Thankfully, the controller caught the mistake and once again told him it would be a left base to runway 4, and this time Joe read back the instruction correctly. This is where it's important to understand that the Winston-Salem Airport has two runways, runway 1533 and runway 422. At the time Joe was trying to land, the winds were out of the north, so the tower was using runway 4 and runway 33. Now my guess is that when Joe heard someone departed from runway 33, he probably just assumed he would be landing on that runway. Either way, the controller assigned him runway 4, and even though that's the shorter runway and it's only about 4,000 feet long, that's more than enough distance to land because the Piper Comanche that Joe was flying only has a ground roll of about 600 to 800 feet. Also, Joe was approaching the airfield from the northwest, so that meant runway 4 was the closest runway for him to land on. Unfortunately, the runway confusion was just the beginning of Joe's problems. When Joe read back the instructions to enter the left base for runway 4, he was about 6 nautical miles from the airport and descending through an altitude of about 3,000 feet. A few seconds later, he said, "That engine's not, but he didn't finish his sentence until almost a minute later when he told the tower controller, "I got one engine that's not making as much power as the other one. We're okay, but that's why we had the hesitation. We're left base for runway 33. The controller corrected him again and told him that he was left base to runway 4, and Joe read back the instruction. At that point, the controller cleared Joe to land on runway 4 and asked if he required any assistance. Joe responded saying no, it was just that one of the engines was running a little slower than the other, so they were okay. Now let me just say a couple things about this. First of all, I'm not sure why Joe kept insisting on runway 33. And I talked about this in a recent video, how one of the first signs that you're losing situational awareness is you start missing or making the wrong radio calls. In this case, I think Joe was probably distracted trying to figure out what was going on with the engine. That being said, I think it's perfectly normal to have that sort of initial reaction when you have an engine problem, especially when you're low to the ground and you don't know what's wrong with the aircraft. You know, the Navy SEALs have a saying that when you're under pressure, you don't rise to the occasion, you sink to the level of your training. And I think that applies just as well to pilots in emergency situations. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this to criticize Joe. I'm bringing it up because none of us know how we're going to react when things go bad. And that's why it's so important to debrief every flight and stay current with your training. The truth is that it doesn't matter how many hours you have, everyone makes mistakes. In this case, Joe was moments away from landing when he started having engine problems, so the safest thing to do would be to keep the aircraft under control, flying at a safe airspeed, and get on the ground as soon as possible, and that would mean landing on runway 4. However, about 90 seconds after Joe reported the engine problem, and after he had been cleared to land on runway 4, he asked if they could land on runway 33, and the controller finally approved his request. Just for reference, this was his approximate location when he made that request. He was about 500 feet above the ground and 1.3 nautical miles from the end of runway 4, and all he needed to do was make a slight turn to land. The reason why Joe was having engine trouble was because, according to the investigation, there was some ABS plastic contamination in the right fuel servo. The source of the contamination couldn't be determined, but the reason this was a problem was because when the right engine power was reduced to idle, the fuel flow to the engine was about 2.6 times higher than what it should have been. Now, the NTSB said that what probably happened was that when Joe pulled the power back during the descent approaching the airport, the excessive fuel flow to the right engine resulted in a total loss of engine power. Unfortunately, instead of landing on runway 4, Joe continued straight ahead, and 1 minute later, he was about a mile from runway 33, but now he was only about 300 feet above the ground, and that's when he told the controller that he needed to make a right 360. We'll never know the reason why Joe wanted to make that turn, because tragically that would be the last radio call he ever made. Instead of making the right 360 as he requested, he continued a left turn to parallel runway 33 on the east side of the airport. The landing gear was fully extended and the flaps were retracted, as witnesses reported seeing the aircraft just barely above the treetops as it began rolling to the left to an inverted position just before crashing in the backyard of a local residence, killing Joe and Patty instantly. One of the most important things you need to know about this aircraft is that VMC is 90 miles per hour. That's the minimum control speed, or the speed at which you can no longer maintain directional control after one engine fails. In fact, the Pilot Operating Handbook recommends maintaining at least 97 miles per hour. It also says that the inoperative engine should be feathered and the gear and flaps retracted. The other thing you need to know about this tragedy is that the aircraft propellers had spring-energized latches that prevent you from feathering the engine once you get below 800 RPM. That's so you don't feather the engine during a normal shutdown on the ground. The NTSB concluded that by the time Joe realized he had a complete engine failure, he had waited too long to feather the prop, and the RPM had dropped too low, preventing him from doing so. That created a very large increase in drag, making it very difficult to maintain control of the aircraft, and he continued to lose airspeed until he got too slow and crashed. Although it's possible that if he raised the landing gear, he might have been able to maintain enough airspeed to keep flying, the truth is that if he had just feathered the prop immediately when he started having engine problems, or if he had landed on runway 4 when he had the chance, it's possible that he and Patty would still be alive today. This was just a very unfortunate tragedy that started because a little piece of plastic contaminant messed up the fuel flow, something that could happen to anyone. Once again, my heart goes out to Joe and Patty's friends and family, and if you learned something from this debrief, then you'll probably like this other one on the screen, so watch that next, and thanks for your support.